Well, look, I spoke earlier this week about this crisis in the Middle East. Yet another round of Israeli-Palestinian combat following a tragic and familiar path. None of this is new. The first large-scale violence between Palestinian Arabs and Jews took place in 1920. Peace negotiations are a waste of time. The violence tends to burn itself out. Yasser Arafat accepted the principle of a two-state solution in the 1993 Oslo Accord, but Hamas, which is a terrorist organisation, wants to merge Israel, the West Bank and Gaza into a single state under Islamist government. This is a proxy war between Israel and the key supporter of Hamas, Iran. The perception that Biden is weak will inevitably lead to Iran agreeing to some deal on nuclear weapons in return for billions of dollars in cash incentives to Iran in exchange for nuclear concessions. Work that out. Re-engaging in a flawed Iran nuclear deal, this is Biden, which would result in Iran acquiring nuclear weapons along with the means to deliver them, and aiding a terrorist nation whose slogans and goals include death to America and death to Israel. The Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu has been pretty straightforward. The ground attack will continue, he said, if Hamas maintain their rocket fire. Mercifully, casualties and damage are limited because of what is known as the Iron Dome system, which has been deployed since 2011. It comprises a network of connected batteries and radars which fire at rockets which seem to be heading to populated areas, but with the technology, they can force them to fall into empty fields. They thought the Iron Dome system would stop functioning, but it hasn't. Significantly, the Israeli military don't believe they're in danger of running out of intercepted missiles anytime soon, but Lebanon's Hezbollah militia has 130,000 rockets, and according to Israeli military estimates, Palestinian Islamic Jihad has 13,000. Where's this heading? What's the significance for us? Dave Sharma is the Liberal member, and a very good one, for the New South Wales federal electorate of Wentworth, but he was ambassador to Israel from 2013 to 2017, and he joins us. Dave Sharma, thank you for your time. You were there in 2014 when the last major conflict occurred. What is the significance of this?
Good evening, Alan. I was there for the last major conflict in 2014, and much like this one, that one was initiated by Hamas firing rockets at civilian populations within Israel, which is exactly what we're seeing now. And much like now, Israel is obviously forced to defend itself and to seek to destroy the launch sites of the rocket attacks, but also to degrade Hamas's military infrastructure. Now,
well, why have
ultimately,
Hamas,
just as in 2014,
why have Hamas provoked this latest firing of rockets at Israel civilian populations?
Well, it's complicated, but it's partly to do with internal Palestinian politics, and it's partly to do with internal Arab politics. There are two main governing entities.
Hello, what's happening here?
Palestinian Authority and Mahmoud Abbas, and there's Hamas in Gaza. And Hamas this is an attempt for Hamas to show that it's more nationalistic, it's a bigger defender of the Palestinians than its rival Fatah in the West Bank, and to be honest, to generate some relevance again, because the Arab world has largely been normalising with Israel and seeking to move on from this conflict, and Hamas is trying to demonstrate once again that they're relevant and attract the support and financial assistance.
But plus the fact, Dave, as I read it, Hamas are fairly unpopular with the majority of Palestinians. Would you agree with that?
Look, absolutely. I mean, this is not an organisation that looks after the welfare of its people. This is a terrorist organisation whose main mission, as declared in their own charter, is the destruction of the state of Israel. So they don't particularly care what sort of conditions their civilian population lives under, and they're not good. But they don't really mind if a conflict with Israel provokes widespread damage to civilian infrastructure and loss of life in Gaza. For them, it's all about the propaganda victory and their own position, if you like, within Palestinian politics.
You've witnessed this Iron Dome missile defence system, which has also, I might add, protected Gaza's civilian population. Very effective, isn't it?
It is. It's very effective. Each of the interceptor missiles, incidentally, costs about $40,000. So each time you fire it, you usually use 2 or 3 of the interceptor missiles to defeat an incoming rocket. It's not a cheap system to use, but Israel has used it and used it well. It's about 90% effective. So some rockets have got through and they have caused civilian casualties. But what it also does, and you made this point, is it actually lessens the impetus for Israel to go in a very heavy way into Gaza. If Israel was taking dozens or hundreds of casualties from rocket fire from Hamas, they would have no choice, as no nation would either, but to go into Gaza in a very heavy way, and that would lead to many more Palestinian casualties on the Gazan side. So Iron Dome is protecting the Israeli civilian population, but it's also lessening the casualties on the Gazan side.
Hamas cannot defeat Israel. So where and when will this end?
Ultimately, this will end when Hamas thinks they've got enough to show as a propaganda victory, and when they've basically replenished their stocks within the Arab and the Palestinian world, their political stocks, their financial stocks. Inevitably, after these conflicts, one of the big Arab states bails them out and gives them a big cash injection to get the issue off the boil and to procure their agreement to a ceasefire. But Hamas, look, they know they can't defeat Israel, but they want to continue in control of Gaza and they want to continue to play a role in Palestinian politics. And this is what they did in 2014, and it took 50 days, but they stopped firing the rockets. I'm hopeful this one will end sooner, but it's really in their hands.
So just the final thing, Netanyahu said, well, we'll keep defending Israel, we'll defend the people of Israel, and if they fire the rockets, we'll actually take retaliatory action. What is this likely to do? Could this strengthen Netanyahu's capacity to form another government?
I think absolutely it has. I think, look, Israel has just had its fourth election in 2 years. Netanyahu, after that election, was given the opportunity to form a government. He was unable to assemble a coalition. The mandate passed to someone else. But almost certainly this conflict has basically elevated Netanyahu's profile. He's known as having very strong security credentials, and this has elevated security as the main issue of concern facing the Israeli public. So I think he's now in a good position to either form a government or, if they have to go to fresh elections, for him to emerge in the box seat to do so.
And just finally, Dave, what does all this mean for us?
Well, look, the loss of life is tragic on both sides. I don't think fundamentally it will change the equation in the Middle East. I think the thing of most concern is that we want to make sure that the Abraham Accords, this is the emerging normalisation between Israel and the Sunni Arab states, is preserved through this, because part of Hamas's goals here is to try and weaken that link. Israel is suddenly to be accepted in the Arab world. Hamas is not happy about that, and part of the purpose of this action is to undermine that. Thus far, states like the UAE and Bahrain and other countries with which Israel has normalised are holding firm, and I think it's important for stability in the region that those agreements persist.
Good on you. Great to talk to you, Dave. Thank you for your insights. Thank you for the work you do. Dave Sharma, very smart bloke. He's the former ambassador to Israel, the current member for Wentworth. And Dave, thank you for your time.